Language is very specific and it should bring clarity to your research process. I'm going to show you now something we discussed in class, which is how to refine a question and also how to spot the traps in existing questions that you really want to avoid. So the question we reviewed was, how can we improve the mental health of prison inmates? So we have the word variables as the language we use within the research project. These are references to terms that are not completely clear and can be subject to interpretation. So, what are the variables in this question? I'm sure you can spot them immediately. The first one is how. Although this is the question stem, we really are asking ourselves, what on earth does the question stem mean in this instance? If we fail to restrict the notion of how, we can be led down a really unclear path. Example would be, I could perhaps improve the mental health of prison inmates simply by setting them free or taking them on a holiday to Bali. The how has no limit. So I ask some questions. What is the question referring to? Or the how? How through legislation? How through legal options? How through well-being support? You can see where we're leading. The more I can make that specific, the question stem, the more my research is directed and focused. Secondly, what do we mean by improve? In the absence of a measuring tool, the notion of improvement is completely subjective. Who determines the criteria for improvement? Who determines the baseline from which improvement can be measured? How do we know when something has improved in the context of mental health? Variable 3. As above, in the absence of criteria, the notion of mental health is vague. We would need to really substantiate our idea of mental health before we could begin any sort of ongoing research. We would have to narrow our parameters to something that's measurable rather than something that is a formless concept. Lastly, and perhaps most tellingly, it's, well, who are prison inmates? Now, we could define that as anybody that's currently in prison. But goodness me, wouldn't we be then opening up a Pandora's box of options? Inmates are not a homogeneous group. They're divided by race, culture, faith, education, wealth, intellect, physical and mental concerns, social prejudice, and in some cases, substance dependence. That group is so diverse that a reference to them as a single entity really becomes nonsensical and doesn't allow us to progress with our research. So the question remains, how can we refine our research? Let's consider this. We can refine our question in the first instance by narrowing the target of the research. We could look at substance abusers in prison who are recidivists, meaning those that come back to prison after serving an initial sentence. We could look at Indigenous youth. We could look at migrant offenders. We could look even, perhaps slightly broadly, at the idea of youth offenders, even though that particular group is a very large and diverse group on its own. And perhaps too often youth are regarded as having common ideas and a common sense of purpose. The question stem could be changed from how to what, leading the researcher to analysis and validation. By focusing the scope of the research to something like strategies or policies, we also achieve a similar sort of refinement. So in this case, the issue, the high incidence of recidivism amongst inmates with backgrounds of in this case specifically crystal meth abuse. The subject, inmates with backgrounds of crystal meth abuse. The variable, recidivism. The question could become what strategies or policies could be employed to reduce recidivism amongst inmates with backgrounds of crystal meth abuse. Hopefully you can see how the question has been reined in, and at least now I can start to do a much more considered investigation than I had previously. Similarly, I could look at a different and perhaps quite relevant subject at the moment, which is the high incidence of incarceration among young Indigenous males, those particularly from rural communities. The subject, young Indigenous males. The variable is incarceration leading to self-harm and suicide. Once again, we narrow the question and we focus. What strategies, policies, or cultural awareness would reduce the incidence of self-harm and suicide amongst Indigenous males from rural communities in the prison system? Eminently researchable. You're going to get data from a variety of sources. You're going to get information that is perhaps contradictory. There'll be a number of different viewpoints to synthesize into your final result.